Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Disrupting the Code. My name is Iliana and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Manara. With us today is Shums Kassam. He is the CTO and co-founder of Hatchways. Hatchways is a platform that helps companies run real-world technical assessments. Companies like Airtable and Plaid use the platform to build practical assessments that better resemble real work to make sure that they're hiring excellent software engineers. Shums, it's so good to have you here today. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. And I realized I didn't check how to pronounce your last name. Did I say it correctly?
Yeah, you did. You did fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Shums, we met a while ago now and would love for our listeners to hear the story of how we met from your eyes. Of course, I'll share my perspective on it.
For sure, for sure. I don't know how we met, but I remember like what the circumstances were. From what I can recollect, you were applying for the Y Combinator program, and somehow Manara kind of was like introduced to me, and then I met you and did like a mock interview. And I still remember the funny incident because I knew you had a different name before. I can't recollect, but I had applied to volunteer for Manara, I think a few years before that meeting. And I was like, oh, you guys didn't accept me because I didn't come from big tech or like something very relevant. That was at least my recollection as being a founder. And then just like did a mock interview for you because we had got into Y Combinator. I think maybe it was like a year and a half before that. And it was just like ever since then, I've been in touch with Iliana and the team just because I'm so excited about their mission and their vision. And we were kind of a similar platform back then, so kind of had a lot of shared learnings that we could kind of share with each other.
Yeah, I was so grateful at the time that you took the time to teach us how to interview. And it's so kind of ironic in a way because we were both building platforms to teach people how to
Yeah,
interview and how to get recognized for the skills that they would bring, right? Which is exactly what you were teaching us. And I always admired you because you were several steps ahead in this journey. And since then, you've pivoted what you're building. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you were building before and why you changed what you're building now?
when Hatchways started, we were building a platform of pre-vetted engineers. So what that meant was candidates would come onto their platform, they would do one assessment and or a series of assessments, and then we would match them with companies that we worked with. However, it was really hard to build a business in that way because we were very niche in terms of who we could focus on. We could only attract smaller startups to work with because they were open to kind of new talent. And on the candidate side, we could only attract oftentimes like not senior developers, very, very junior developers. And that only kind of created a really small market. And our mission has always been to kind of improve and change the interview process. And so as we were going through that process, we had built a new and innovative interview type, which was what we're focusing on now. And we realized like we can make a bigger impact by focusing on that interview type and trying to get companies use that as a tool and try to change kind of more of the root problem, which is like how we think of people interviewing today, as opposed to just building a platform where people come on and get matched with companies. So that was kind of the trajectory that Hatchways went over for the past couple of years.
I love it because there's basically two different ways of solving this problem of how do you identify great talent that doesn't necessarily stand out in an existing process, right? And either you solve it on the talent side by helping them stand out in the existing process, or
Exactly.
you solve it on the company side by building a better, different process.
Yeah, and I think a couple of our learnings as we went through this is like it's really hard to change the way people work or like interact. And so when we were doing it on the like talent side, we basically were a blind assessment platform. So the idea was like no matter what your background, you do an assessment and then we match you with the company and use our assessment, not like their background. So you can hire more diverse talent and so many more benefits that way. But we found companies still reverted back to what they were used to. They would ask for resumes and we're like, we don't use resumes. They would ask for like, what's the person's background? And like, I don't want to meet them unless I know they have X number of years of experience. And that basically created this like big tension in our platform where we were trying to push our beliefs towards the kind of companies we were working with. And when we did that, it just didn't work. It worked for like occasionally like really interesting, amazing circumstances where we did change people's minds, but it was really hard to kind of make a systemic change. And so we pivoted and focused on, well, maybe there's just like a really, it's what we learned is like, it's actually really hard to build a practical, good interview process. And so let's help companies do that, slowly change them by changing the way interviews work and make them more open to talent in that way. And that's kind of the pivot that we made.
Yeah, because companies are frequently aware that they're just using an interview process that exists because they don't know or can't find something better, right? There are, of course, the occasional or maybe frequent engineers who've only worked at big tech and all they know is the data structures and algorithms interview and they swear by it. But I think that's changing, isn't it?
Yeah, and so we're starting to see a movement towards. I think the size of company is an interesting size. So they're not like huge companies where they're like Google or Facebook, because we understand like the scalability of data structure and algorithms makes sense for their size. It's really hard to change at that stage. So we're not seeing much change there. But these companies that are like just pre-IPO, Series D, E, F, like they're getting larger. We're starting to see a big shift in their mindset on how to interview, because actually it's almost also there's a competitive advantage, because if you interview like Google will identify X pieces of talent. But if you interview in a practical setting, for example, asking them to work off of like a practical project or do like pair programming in a practical way, you end up finding different talent that may be overlooked by Google. And so we're starting to see like some benefits in there and starting to see companies changing that way. And also, I think on the candidate side, there's also a movement, because I think the world is just like changing in terms of how you learn how to code, right? And this has been a situation for a long time, right? There's more boot camps and more companies like Manara where they're kind of gaining access to learning how to code outside of traditional like top universities in the States or top universities in North America and in the West. So seeing that shift in the diversity of talent, you're going to get people that have learned a lot of different ways, and vetting them is going to be really hard, but at least there'll be like more diverse ways to see if they're good talent. And I think that's going to change because candidates are going to push that change as well, where they're like, why are we doing leak code? I never have to do this in a job, for example. Or like we see a lot of like no leak code, no whiteboard movements that are happening on that side.
Yeah, and just for our audience, not everyone's going to know necessarily what lead code or data structures and algorithms interview is. So let me jump in with my understanding, and then you can correct me. I am not a software engineer. I have, launched an entire company that helps identify top talent, and in large part, the approach we take today is preparing talent for those interviews and also for what it requires to be successful in the job after the interview. And we find that those are two very different things. And that's kind of the whole spark of this no lead code movement, right? So I'll explain it, and then Shums, you're an actual software engineer, so you can you can do some corrections after I explain it. But the way I understand it is that there are some computer science fundamentals that traditionally have been learned in college, and then there's specific types of problems that you can solve in code using these different fundamentals. So these things are called data structures or algorithms, and you'll get a problem that has nothing to do with anything you would code in real life. It might be like, imagine that there's 52 people in a room and 105 pizzas. How can you optimize the number in different slices that each person gets? Something like that, right?
Right,
And then
right.
you have to realize which of these data structures or algorithms is going to be the one that solves the problem the most optimally. And there's some relevance to that in the workplace in the sense of like you can get used to concepts like how do you make the results show up as fast as possible, so performance of that type, or how can you use the least steps to get there and thus the least space on the machines that you're spinning up to run this code, right? So there's certain parts of it that are very relevant to to creating code that scales. But overall, it is a game that you basically have to learn how to play to be able to solve these problems, solve them quickly, solve them in front of somebody else who's timing you and
Yep.
interacting with you in the process. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a great, and I can add a little bit more thoughts on that. But essentially, yeah, there's like fundamentals of computer science that you described, and those involve like data structure and algorithms, and a lot of programming is built on top of that, right? And the reality is like, and this is not the case for every engineer, right? There are people that are working on improving the core data structure and algorithms of lots of systems, but in reality, most engineers work at a layer that is abstracted from a lot of that information. So they're most of the time kind of stringing together services. So for example, like the service does something like this, you need to pull information from there, manipulate it, and then put it somewhere else. And so, or even if a front end developer is like completely different than any of the things that we're talking about. Sometimes data structure and algorithms play, but the reality is maybe like in terms of data structure and algorithms, you need to have like a certain level of understanding. Let's say beginner understanding. But most of the developers in day to day, they need to have a beginner understanding of data structure and algorithms, but like a very good understanding of how to pull services together, how to communicate as a developer, a lot of these soft skills. How do you write good, clean, organized code so other people can read it? That's where the complexity and difficulty of being a software engineer is nowadays for most engineers. And the reality is that we test them on the code style. And the problem is we don't test them on the easy questions that they should know because it's a test and we need to vet candidates. And most people know the easy stuff that they know. So Google and Facebook, what they'll do is they'll increase the complexity of that to a point where it's like, wait, why are you testing me? And the equivalent is like, why are you testing me on like the axioms of linear algebra when I know how to reverse a matrix or whatever, like, whatever you have to do with matrices. Like that's the kind of equivalency. When reality, we should kind of be shifting our focus into a lot of these other diverse, soft related skills, communication related skills, collaboration skills, working with data in a different way, using APIs, practical kind of related topic areas that are built on these fundamentals. But those are like the day to day that people have to do. And there's difficulty there. We can definitely ramp up the difficulty there. It's just a different skill set altogether. And so that's where the problem I see rises.
So just to clarify, are these assessments still being done live? The interviewer meets the candidate has to figure out how to write code in front of an interviewer. There's that whole, because usually software engineers work quietly.
Yep.
And interviewing in front of a person we see in our community is a really big challenge, more so for women than for men, but just
Yep.
in general, it's like a whole new thing you have to get used to write code in front of somebody else. So is that still how it works when somebody's using your new product?
Good question. Our main primary use case is for asynchronous interviewing. So where you're not interacting with the individual. And it adds a couple of challenges for us to solve. But it provides, we've always been a candidate facing company. So we avoid proctoring, for example. So even if it's async, we're not going to record your screen. We're not going to watch you code because that just defeats the purpose. You're basically making a live interview asynchronous. So we've been a lot focused on building tools around that. However, there are companies in Canada that use our platform for pair programming. So they'll get on a call and just use the tool in a pair programming setting. And I think it depends on the company here, right? I'm a big proponent of asynchronous because that's how we work. We're a remote company. That's how a lot of companies work. I give somebody a task. I talk to them on Slack. That's how I interview. That's how I interview, and that's how I work, right? Whereas some companies, they actually do jump on calls, they pair program. It's actually more of like and I think this requires good interview training in the company to how do you run a pair programming interview where it actually feels like your peers and not like, actually, I'm just watching you code and do your own thing. I've seen good companies do that. Actually, Intercom is one of them where they jump off the call. So they get on a call, say, go work on it, jump off the call, work on it on your own. I see other companies like on our platform that do similar things. So long story short is like, I'm a personal proponent for asynchronous style interviews. Our main use case is asynchronous style because that is the closest to real work, but not always the case. So we're not like super restrictive on that front. And there's a lot of research on why you should go asynchronous. But then I think the biggest concern we get from companies is like, how do you know this is the person that did it? And like, that's the big concern that they have. And we have a lot of recommendations, and our general recommendation is you shouldn't make your whole interview process where you don't interact with the person, because that's also not realistic. But the live coding piece, just don't do live coding. Like, do a discussion with them. That's a practical thing. Talk through their solution, talk through how did you arrive at this problem as a follow-up. And then you can see, like, it's going to be clear. Did this person just throw this into ChatGPT, or like, did they actually solve this problem?
On that note, what else are you learning about how to solve for imposter syndrome or how to solve for diverse candidates?
That's a great question. So in terms of, that is a tough one. Actually, there's one more, which is not something we do, we used to do, but not something we necessarily propose to companies. But as you talk to companies, something that we've seen work is more of a blind hiring approach. So what that means is like kind of if you're open to more junior talent, because the thing with more senior talent is blind hiring doesn't always work because you kind of need to attract them to apply to your job. But if you're open to more junior talent, giving them almost an assessment before you look at their background or resume or things like that, where you can add bias. And the best thing about being blind is like you're not actually looking at who this person is while you're assessing the assessment, can go a long way. And it will change your biases. It changed my biases because, as I mentioned, like I came from more of a privileged background, and my whole team is all female and not like at all the like what I look like. So in terms of that, like it changed my biases on like who to hire, how to hire. I've also hired like talent that with disabilities or things like that, like a lot of things that you would not necessarily think, oh, this is a good talent coming from top school type of thing. Blind hiring, I think, is one of the best ways I've seen affected. Actually, I have a personal example with that. There's a company we worked with, two ex-Facebook engineers, and I still very much remember how with our old product we used to like do this like, okay, look at their profile, just look at their assessment, don't look at their background. And they ended up hiring a boot camp grad with no background in computer science, as a librarian, ex-librarian. And once they hired that person, that completely changed the way that they interviewed going forward. They started only doing like basically always doing blind assessments. Even if it's in the middle of the process, they would just scrap all personal detail and just do that. And it was all take home based. And they ended up not doing it for a certain piece of time. Like they hired senior developers and they ended up having to let go of those developers because this boot camp grad would outperform them. And so like it was very interesting how we kind of shifted their mindset. And I feel like that's a good way. It's one of the good ways to kind of shift people's mindset on hiring.
So for someone who wants to institute a blind process and has never done it before, what's the first step?
Great question. So the thing is, it worked well because we had technology. It's really hard to do without technology. The process is, in general, there's like different ways to do it, but the process that we did it was the first interview that you do is a take-home assessment where you ask them to do something practical, and then you look at everybody's solution without looking at who this person is, and then just base them off that. This worked really well for new grad and junior hiring, like I mentioned, because you'll get people completing this without talking to a human. With seniors, it was harder because just nobody would do it. And so that was the process. And so you kind of need some technology in place. Selfish like plug is like you could use Hatchways platform for that because we can definitely send it, and we use kind of a human automated review process to vet them so that you're not just looking at automated passing. But I think that's a very important part. Like when you look at the results, if you're automating it, you're creating some inherent bias towards how you're hiring, and you'll ignore some of those diverse skills that you really care about. Before you create, the real crux and difficulty of this is like how you create a good assessment that's representative of real work. And that I think is a lot actually about creating what we call like a job kit, or like basically taking the approach of looking at what skills you want to measure, creating a rubric first, then developing the assessment around the rubric, then kind of releasing that, making sure it's tested, tested in a way that it's not too out of scope. It's not going to deter candidates because it's not interesting or not, it's too long. So there's a lot of that goes into that, and then tracking metrics as you do it, because if you end up not tracking metrics, usually the first thing you launch is never like perfect. So it's kind of like a startup, like, you got to iterate on the assessment and then improve it. But it's totally worth it because oftentimes you see companies that create these assessments, they can reuse them, and they're like pretty solid in terms of helping them hire.
I remember at Manara very early on, I think it was our third cohort, we had just started using code signal as the test that we used to screen out people who can't even solve a basic coding question. So very, very low bar. Oh, actually, at the time, our bar was higher. Here's the deal. We were trying to figure out exactly that question of what should the bar be. And we had set it at a certain result in code signal, certain score. And we were wondering if we were missing out on candidates in particular because we noticed a lot of women were in a zone that was below the bar that we had set. And we ended up having one of our mentors, so somebody in our network like you, get on the platform and just start reading code, reviewing code. And he spotted a specific person whose score was 50 points below our bar and said, this person's code is fantastic. Like, I would totally bet on this person. You should drop the bar to this level. That person ended up being the first person in Manara who ever got into a
Oh,
big tech
cool.
company. He got into Google.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about automating this is it's actually really hard. And
Mm.
even if we were to use ChatGPT to do it, you can create inconsistencies, right? And that's one of the challenges that I think we face as a company. And I don't have a great solution to that. My opinion is to automate part of it and to actually just get humans to spend time and review, because you'll actually probably save time in the other end of the interview process by reviewing their code before getting on a call with them, basically. Yeah.
So let's talk more about both of those pieces, because I was actually talking to one of my team members yesterday about whether there was any way that Manara could leverage your product. And she mentioned that there is a human review as a part of your product, that you are actually hiring people to review code. So would love to hear about that. And then, of course, ChatGPT, AI, how it's going to change software engineers' jobs is on everybody's minds these days. So would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, those are two great questions. In terms of the human review part, like I mentioned, we have software that helps make human reviewing faster, and we're slowly starting to release those. We have, like, basically you can use our platform in two ways. You can review the code yourself and use a lot of our tooling that we're building, and we're starting to integrate. We have automated testing on more practical projects. That's a little bit harder to do. Like, oftentimes automation in our competitors is like more just test cases, but we have like ability to create screenshots, things like that. So you can kind of do a little bit more automation on more practical assessments. And then we're working on even using ChatGPT to help like identify things. But then at the end of the day, we have humans that do the review.
What do you mean
For
by identify things?
So, for example, ChatGPT is pretty good at like saying how you could improve your code, like code quality. It's kind of what I call like a super linter nowadays. And a linter is basically a formatter. How do you measure that the code is written in a nice formatted way? Sometimes ChatGPT can be a really good way, of like super powered version of that, where you can tell somebody, oh, you didn't separate your code well here. And the reason I think that's really cool is that we can start releasing those tools for people to do the review themselves and basically take what we're doing as our team is doing as well, if they don't want a full packaged kind of expensive solution, basically. So long story short is like we have tooling that helps you review it yourself. And then we also, for some of our clients that want to do more scale, we'll do the reviewing for them. And ideally we can put the cost lower because we have that tooling that our team kind of dog foods that own our own product in that sense. So that's kind of the long story about like our human assisted technology and on reviewing code. In terms of Chat GPT, I have a lot of thoughts because it's affecting us most directly. And in fact, we're getting clients from competitors because of the fact that we've been putting out content out there, how we're a bit more adaptive to Chat GPT and AI. And the reality is, this is my high level perspective. The way that engineers will code is going to change. It's already changing. It's going to change in the sense that a best example of that is the way we write code will be different because um, um, the most easy to understand example is that ChatGPT is good at writing code, right, for you in a certain context, in a certain circumstance. But what you need a human to do is evaluate the response from ChatGPT to say, like, this is actually something I want. This is actually something that solves my problem well. And that problem and that skill is going to be increasingly important for developers, right? Because essentially what I'm trying to say is that reading code and evaluating its like ability to solve your problem is going to become an increasingly important skill versus actually writing code and solving a problem, because you can probably outsource that first, because you can ask ChatGPT, given the context of this problem, and like solve this bug, for example, for me, or fix or write some code. But you still need a human to see if that prompt is good or is that an actual thing that I want to solve. So as the kind of skill set starts shifting and changing, we need to start evaluating those skills a little bit better. So we're starting to work on things like review code assessments. So instead of asking somebody, we give them a GitHub repo of like a project and say like review a pull request, and or for example, and even work with ChatGPT. We're starting to integrate ChatGPT into our product. So like you get access to it, you can talk with it, and we evaluate your conversation with it. which is also probably something that people will do more often. And I personally think the way that AI will be integrated for developers is going to be through your IDEs. So your I think it's called interactive development environment. I know it's pathetic. I don't know
It's
what it
that
is.
box that you
Yeah,
write in and has different colors and
yeah.
formatting. Yeah, yeah.
Basically, GitHub Copilot, which is
Uh-huh.
releasing like GitHub Copilot X, which is like the ChatGPT powered version of it, is basically integrating your like ChatGPT into the IDE of how you write code, and how you write code is going to be basically changed because of that. And I know other tooling is doing the same thing, right? Obviously, competitors are going to show up, and the point is that when you want to do something in the future, you'll probably like to write like a few, like one or two keystrokes and you'll have it done versus like in the past where you had to write a whole file. And so basically, long story short, is like we want to give that tooling to people as quick as possible and just change the problem so that we're solving those higher level problems like reading code or evaluating the output of chat gpt or like kind of changing what we measure because the skills we're going to have are going to be totally different.
So, what is the impact on diverse talent? You and I both launched our companies because we care so much about untapping human potential, right? And we see that diverse candidates often don't get same opportunities. How
Yeah,
is
that's
ChatGPT or AI changing all of that, if at all?
yeah, my main concern right now is access to these tools. Like um hopefully that I think the open source community will help with this, but right now GPT-4 is a paid tool that you have to, and GitHub Copilot X is a paid tool that you have to pay to get access to. And I'm hoping that through open source community and like eventually there's a lot of leaking of like different of these models, that the models that are free are going to be the same cost as those ones that cost. And that as soon as that's kind of my biggest concern, but once it becomes like a readily accepted tool that everybody has equal access to, it can help diversity, right? Because you're empowering developers to do more. We just need to make sure that they're learning these skills and have access to the tools is kind of what my biggest concern is right now from a diverse perspective.
I am really curious about how this is going to impact diverse candidates. And as soon as you start hearing some stories from the ground, I hope you can circle back and share that with us because overall, my observation through the many years that I've been interested in this problem is that what we often take for granted and we think is going to equal the playing field
Hmm.
often actually is something that we're learning through our networks. We don't even notice it. It's like the air that we're
Yeah.
breathing. And so, like, I could imagine a scenario where a somebody who has imposter syndrome doesn't even think that they should use chat gpt, thinks that it's going to be counted against them and so they don't, or um, that reviewing the results is something that people aren't learning as much from
Yeah.
their environment. I remember when I moved to Jordan and I had a roommate who was from Syria, and every time he told me anything that I found a little bit, you know, lacked some credibility, I would Google it, right? The guy had never heard of the concept of going and Googling something. And this is, of course, not a software engineer, and it's a
Yeah.
while ago. I think now in the region, people are very familiar with the idea of being skeptical and Googling things. But it really struck me at the time that I had just assumed this was a skill that everybody had, and everyone knew that when you're given information, you can just double check is the information correct, right? It turns out that things that we consider really basic skills are often things that we actually learn from a friend who sits next to us in class.
No, this is a really good point, and that's why I feel like there's going to be an unfair advantage before the before this gets mass adoption. And I keep forgetting that I'm in a bubble where I can reflect that bubble because we run assessments for companies, and some of our assessments are pretty easy and people do worse than if you were to just put it into ChatGPT, which makes me know that they're not using ChatGPT to solve it, right? So, and that's more often, way more often. In fact, the only times that we see ChatGPT is when companies put moles into the product and they just pretend to be a candidate and they just test us just to see if we can identify it. So that's where it's kind of interesting. Obviously, we don't know for sure if people are using ChatGPT or not. It's obviously a big problem to solve, but based off of how well people are doing, like I can tell that like the average candidate is not familiar with the tooling. And I think this is where it's important to educate, right? Because you can use a free version of a lot of these tools, and it's like kind of like why we need to unfortunately, I'm not solving this problem, but Manara can solve this problem, right? To kind of integrate more practical, more newer tools into the program to kind of share with their cohorts on like how to use ChatGPT. What does this mean? How should you practice using it? We encourage usage and not discourage usage because it's only a matter of time before it gets integrated into our daily lives.
Let's talk about a few other types of diversity. You've thought about this problem so much and in so many different contexts. You've thought about it in the context of people with disabilities, of people going on paternity or maternity leave. Would love to hear a little bit about those types of diversity and how you think about them as hatchways or just how you think about
Yeah.
them as shums.
Yeah, good question. I think some of the personal stories and how we built Hatchways is most relevant. So on the diversity front, we one of our the first employee actually of Hatchways, he had a hearing impairment, and that was such an interesting story because we didn't know, obviously, because we gave him a take home assessment and he did really well, and then I think he mentioned it the next stage where we had a discussion that like, can we do a video call so I can see how I can see your lips and I can talk to you because of this challenge. But he passed the first stage of our interview, which was a really important part of the interview. And for that reason, we got really excited about him. And we ended up working with him closely and then eventually hiring him. And he shared a lot of his personal stories around, the first step is usually a call. It's usually a call, phone call. It's usually with a recruiter. And being even more
Is that
specific.
still true, by the way, Shums? I know it used to be true and it used to be called a phone screen, but does anyone really
Yeah,
still
actually,
do
that's a
phone
very
screens?
good question. Not really, maybe. So maybe he's less as an issue right now. Maybe that's been solved for him.
That's
Um,
the one benefit of COVID, right?
yeah, that's actually true. This was pre-COVID. But that was very interesting because I remember him asking for accommodation and still not getting it in certain places because they just didn't
Wow.
understand. So,
Yeah, I mean, I
um,
remember the days people didn't have video chatting as a company. Google was the first with Google Meet, and everybody else was still doing phone calls. Yeah.
so that was interesting.
And
But
so, what was the lesson learned then about him or about people with disabilities?
yeah, so I think him and another case was actually a stutter example. So that was a little bit more. A couple of candidates we've actually helped that had a stutter, and I think it's again coming down to accommodating in the interview process, knowing that, especially like again, phone screens, right? Like if you're doing something, we call it phone screens, but even like a video screen, just understanding the candidate where they're coming from and ignoring that noise, like knowing that a stutter, as a software engineer, actually the first employee, he phrased it best when he talked about this actually in one of our podcasts. It was basically like it's actually best for people with disabilities to work in tech because you're often trying to build technology to help these types of people. And as a developer, like it's like literally the best job because you're working most of the time remotely. You're using chat. You're using tools to help talk to each other. Not for every type of disability, but for his, for example, or for someone with a stutter, or for someone with kind of the other example we had was ADHD and like OCD, where actually they are good at. I didn't know this until I worked with candidates of that background. Is like they're not good at repetitive, easy tasks, but they're really good at difficult, challenging tasks they can get extremely interested and excited about. So just knowing that and designing your not just your interview process, but knowing that that might be a good fit for your team is kind of very important, I think, in this day and age.
Cool. I did want to touch a little bit on your personal background. You are a Muslim in tech. We recently published a report on how to be inclusive towards Muslims, or in our case, also to people from the Middle East and North Africa, which is a group of people you haven't had a lot of exposure to. Uh, any experiences that you've had or experiences you've heard of other people having that you hope companies would be a little bit more aware of?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I think for Muslims the biggest challenge, not I'm not gonna say the biggest challenge because I can't speak also for all Muslims, but one of the challenges I see recurring for people in my circle is just like the difference in social interaction that you have, especially around like happy hours and alcohol and events, and it's less of an issue actually in the remote world where, but anytime, like any even remote company, they kind of bring people together at some point. And a lot of people feel very uncomfortable in those circumstances. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that. And it just becomes challenging as a Muslim to explain, like, oh, I don't want to be at an event with alcohol. I think that's really hard for some people. They're like, oh, just don't drink. But like, it's just the environment you're not comfortable with, or like in general. And I think that's like one of the biggest issues I see in my friend circle, and in general, I kind of commonly see. And it happens more on the business side instead of the tech side, because oftentimes like networking and all that is like how you move up the ladder. And a lot of the times alcohol is a big like culture involved in that, and it's hard to move up the ladder. And the in certain professions, not my profession, I'm thank God like that's not an issue I've had, but I've seen in others where like that's just part of the culture. And it's hard to kind of see that. And I think just having more networking opportunities that are not so the social dynamic is different will accommodate a lot more Muslims out there.
This
Yeah.
is super interesting because literally on our last podcast, we interviewed another Muslim who had the opposite take on this. And I love that because it creates, I think, shows the diversity of
There's
perspectives,
diversity
right?
for sure.
And her perspective was like, you guys feel free to keep doing events with alcohol, but just stop asking me why I'm not drinking, and just stop offering me like. And I can relate to this a lot as well because
Yeah,
I don't have a religious reason not to drink, but I generally prefer not to drink. And people just get so offended by the fact that I'm not drinking. I'm like, what problem does it create for you that I am holding a sparkling water in my hands? I don't understand how this is making you have less fun at this event. So that was the perspective we walked away with from the last podcast.
interesting.
But you're bringing the perspective of no, it's actually really uncomfortable to be invited or to feel like pressure to participate in an event where
I
there
think
is
it's the
alcohol.
pressure to participate that's really challenging, right? So it's kind of related to your perspective as well, where it's like it's hard for sometimes to explain, like, I don't want to go to this event because of the environment, and like it's just challenging for me. And so I think this also comes down to being also a dad, and like the other aspects of it, like being a parent, and like you know what I mean. And that's kind of where I think it's like challenging. You almost like when someone asks you to join it, if you make it optional even, but they're like kind of pressuring you into joining, you almost feel like I need to go, but I'm not going to enjoy myself. And then it just becomes like a hard thing to do for some people. So
Just
yeah.
to be clear, though, the not enjoying is because people are pressuring to drink,
Yeah.
or because you're just around. Like, so one example just recently is that we had a Manara alumni event in London, and our engineering tech lead from France came, and he whispered to me and said, "Is it okay if I order a beer?" Of course, 95% of the people at the table are not drinking alcohol,
Right.
and I was like, "Sure, no problem. I don't think anybody's going to mind that you're drinking beer." So was that a mistake that I made? Should I have encouraged him not to drink alcohol in the presence of
Um,
people who aren't?
that is a very good question. So it's gonna get really technical. But
Yeah.
I think it depends on who you're talking about. And then here's the diversity within the Muslim community about that. And I think this is where it gets even more complicated, because as a certain denomination of Muslim, you might have different perspectives than other Muslims on this specific issue. And this is where it gets hard, because you're like trying to explain to somebody the more nuances of this, and they may not understand it. So coming back to your original question about the comfortability, it is about having to explain it. Like, you're going and you're like, you're not explaining it. But then for certain denominations, such as myself, like actually being for example, a certain Shia Isnashri that follows um, a certain person, they actually, you can't eat at a table where alcohol is there. Like, you're
Wow.
restricted to do that. And so
Mhm.
there's diversity, so much diversity in what Muslims can do. And of course, for some Muslims, this is not an issue at all. And so for some of them, there is an issue. And I think that's where I get the uncomfortability. I'm even uncomfortable explaining this here, because it's just
Yes.
like,
Yes.
it's
Well,
like,
thank you so much for taking on that work to explain it. And, as somebody who works a lot with Muslims, what this is helping me realize is how often the Muslims I work with are of a specific denomination. And so how little exposure I have had to that diversity. And I'm really grateful that you're sharing that with me so I can be more aware, and also with our audience so that people can be more aware. But I do apologize for putting you through that.
yeah, no, not at all. I mean, this is a safe space. And also, like, I think the complication is also around, like, with this is like, so this is where I get uncomfortability too. It's like, I have this personal rule, but do I want to make everybody accommodate for me? Right? Because now it's like, so I've had like conversations with Muslims where they do such funny things, like they'll move the table, like they have a little table that they can sit and eat here, and then they have everybody else, and it just makes so much complication around these kind of circumstances. And
I mean, I
it's,
think the
yeah.
takeaway is have events where there's no alcohol involved. Like, just don't make alcohol such a big part of the professional sphere, right? And one example that I remember that was shocking to me, even though I know less about this than you do, was that a Palestinian that I know well, a woman from Gaza, was living in Germany, and she was invited to be a speaker at a large event, and she gave her talk, and then at the end they gave her a thank you gift in front of this whole audience, and the thank you gift was a bottle of champagne, or or wine or
It's
something.
happened to me too.
Like, yeah, right? Like, what are people thinking? And that seems like a basic level of knowledge that people should be able to at least consider. But of course, people don't necessarily even ask or know what the religious background is, and somehow, even if they know, they often don't think about it. So we could at least start with that goal of
Yeah.
not giving alcohol as gifts to people who probably can't drink it. Of course, being aware that there are some Muslims who do, right? There's a whole variety. Um, Thank you for sharing that. I Now I know a little bit more about why you've been to Iraq and Iran. I know you mentioned that to me once, and I was so curious because these are parts of the world that so many of my friends and my professional contacts have never had a chance to go to. And they're parts of the world that are replete with talent. In Manara, one of our largest sources of talent is Iraq. And as a US company, we're unfortunately not able to service Iran, but I'm sure, I mean, I just know the tech sector there is huge. The talent pool is huge in Silicon Valley. There's so
Yeah.
many people from Iran. Did you have a chance to interact with the talent at all, the local community when you were there?
A little bit more with Iran. Like, so I have, my brother is married to an Iranian, and just like understand their culture there. They are very big in computer science and very well educated across women and men. So like very high education rates. And I think it is really sad actually um, because of the like, just like a lot of the lack of access. Like you have a lot of Iranians living in Iran, and they're not like, they're living under this country, and they can't, it's not like they have control over their circumstances, and they don't have access to um, the ability to work remotely, really. And that's what's really challenging, because it's an extra barrier. Because if you're not living in Iran, you could be living somewhere else, and you could still work remotely and work in a lot of these jobs. And I think that's like, we've seen that actually even at Hatchways, where we've had people apply from Iran, and we were a platform, and we couldn't really, we've supported them because some countries can interview and hire them, but it just reduces the talent pool that you can kind of serve for that situation. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a hiring partner at the trade desk who has offices in Australia, and one of their engineering leaders there is from Iran, and she was telling us about the applications they get from people to relocate and how amazing the talent pool is, but even relocations end up taking them a long time, like a year to process. And so they're invested. They know about the talent pool, and they know that they're going to be
That's great.
continuously hiring, so they're making that investment. But it's not easy. I am curious, for countries like Iraq and Palestine, we often see in our community that even though the raw talent is there haven't been as many opportunities locally. And so a mid-level developer, somebody, let's say, with 5 years of experience, won't have hit the same level of experience as somebody with 5 years of experience in the United States or Canada or Europe. And it's not at all a reflection of their lack of abilities. It's lack of access to companies and coworkers who are working on such challenging problems. Lots of startups that are just so early stage with such few users that you don't have the same experiences with scalability and things like that. Is that the case also in Iran? Or I imagine it to be a place that has a lot more businesses, and therefore that
That's a
people's
good
career
question.
trajectories stay more on track with what you'd expect in Europe and the US.
I don't know the answer to that question, but that is a good question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Shams, it has been such a pleasure to have you here. I know we're going to need to wrap up soon. Is there anything that you haven't had a chance to share yet that you'd like to tell us about?
That is a good question.
So I'm so good
I
at
was like, I
asking
don't know.
questions. This is why I'm a podcast host, Shums, because I'm so
Yeah,
good at asking questions.
and you kind of exhausted a lot of the things that I did want to talk about. So, but maybe to
Well,
conclude it, yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say maybe to conclude, just a little bit about Hatchways and what we're trying to do here. But we are a platform that's helping companies run asynchronous and synchronous practical assessment processes. If you want to make your assessment look more like real work and provide it to your and to kind of run a process that's more fair and equitable is kind of what we're working on. So I'd love to just plug that in, and yeah, that's kind of what I would end with.
And it's such an important problem to solve. I know so many startups and bigger companies as well are really trying to address that now. I'm thrilled to see where you're at in your founder journey, Shums, since I first met you. Thank you so, so much for joining us. Thank you for listening to this episode of Disrupting the Code. You can listen to us on Spotify or watch our full episodes on the Manara channel on YouTube. Thanks again, and tune in soon for the next episode.